lecture in Irish Studies. This is um, slightly sad to say my last formal event as Director of Irish Studies. I just want to take the opportunity, even though she's not here, she's downstairs directing people in, to thank formally Kathy Devlin, who's the Administrator in Irish Studies, without whom I think I probably wouldn't have lasted the last 10 years, and things would have been much more chaotic than they actually have been. Uh, So I'll thank Kathy personally when I see her, but I just wanted to start by doing that. So our international lecture this year, the international lecture is the event we have at the end of the Irish Studies annual programme, where we have a very distinguished speaker coming from outside the island of Ireland to speak on some aspect of Irish Studies and to share their recent research with us. I'm delighted this year, someone who many people in the room will know personally or know of, at least Hedwig Schwall has been able to join us. Hedwig has been at the centre of the development of Irish studies as a discipline on the continent of Europe for many years. She's Professor Emerita at the Catholic University of Leuven, and was a founding figure and still plays a very active role both in Ephesus, the European Federation of Associations and Centres of Irish Studies, and in the very dynamic Leuven Centre for Irish Studies. Her range of interests are very wide. She's published on our Irish literature, on psychoanalysis and art. She's been on the editorial board of series such as Art and Religion. In 2019, she edited The Danger and the Glory, an anthology of 60 contributions from Irish writers about the art of writing. The second installment of this was called About Europe in Ireland. And the third will focus, a project that Hedwig is currently working on. The third installation of this project will be on faith, spirituality, and art, new perspectives for the 21st century. She was director of the Leuven Centre for Irish Studies from its foundation in 2010 until 2021. She was a founding member of RISE, the Review of Irish Studies in Europe, and has been on the advisory board of many journals, both in Irish Studies and in literature. And she's now preparing a book on parent-child relations in contemporary Irish fiction, and runs a number of kind of online activities, including the Ephesus Book Club and the in-person Ephesus International PhD Seminar, which takes place every second year as well. So it's a great pleasure to have Hedwig with us here today. And she's going to talk about the subject of interactionality in contemporary Irish fiction with a focus on motherly interactions. Hedwig, you're very welcome.
Analysis, and so it has a broader scope, which I hope will be of interest to you. Interactionality is a bit of a big word, but you will see that it's actually very self-evident. So interactional means different from individual. And so when we look at the individual in contemporary Irish fiction, we see that people like Derek Hand say, more important than any one theory is how the novel is a site where the emergence of the individual into modernity can be witnessed. The novel form might allow for the complexities of the Irish individual to be played out. So what we will focus on is not individuality, but the complexity of being individual. We then read in Claire Bracken, who's quoted in Catherine Brenhack's article that I will mention later. Bracken says that the individual is alienated by neoliberalism and by digital space being TikTok and all the actually addictive social media that we will see and that we will situate in the individual. We then see that Katharina Brenhack says that the voices of the Celtic tiger in feminist literature are much more conversational in the post-tiger period. And with conversational, we mean that there is conversation, there is interaction between people, and it's in this interaction that they actually form their self. Then Paige Reynolds, in her book Modernism in Irish Women's Contemporary Writing, says that she focuses on the neglected aspects of female subjectivity. So we will pick up on being not an individual but conversational and on female subjectivity. Further, Renhack says she looks at how contemporary Irish authors enlist the full arsenal of narrative strategies to decenter the individual without destroying the character's individuality. So now we move from individuality to decentering the individual. And how does that happen? By looking at character. And character is not just a kind of emotional personality, but it's also the person as a character, as something that you can read. So then we see that when Renhack looks at what does this mean, this feminine subjectivity and focus of characters, she studies a novel by Enright and one by Donald Ryan, and she says Enright's and Ryan's fictions seem to be driven by the moral imperative to create a conversational aesthetics, to imagine worlds that are less rigidly monologic and confrontational, less focused on the individual, and less hierarchically structured than those created by the dominant capitalist heteropatriarchal discourses that shape the real world. So what we will remember is that in the past, literature was monologic and confrontational and hierarchically structured. So this will, I will argue that this will change in the novels under scrutiny. We then see that Fintan O'Toole says Ireland did not start one fixed thing and it moved between different kinds of unfixity. So instead of entities and instead of being fixated, he focuses, so in a feminine way, if you like, on unfixity. And he says that there is a new stance of openness, the ability in Ireland to embrace unfixity and willingness to effect change. They are constituent ingredients of contemporary Ireland. This is what Anne Fogarty and Eugene O'Brien say in the introduction to the Routledge Companion to 21st Century Irish Writing. So, which are the basics of our theory, of our methodology? We move from individual entities and thinking in terms of entities to interaction. What does that mean? Well, I had an interview with Lisa McInerney, and she said, we have a capacity to dismantle some of this individualism. And this is one of the big tasks that literature has to face up to at the moment. So no less, but focus on we are not individuals, but then what are we? And she is also part and parcel of this project that Peter was mentioning, Irish Voices on Faith, Spirituality and Art. You can find that in open access, and so she talks there about that individualism is something of the past. We also see that Anne Fogarty and Eugene O'Brien in their Routledge Companion to Contemporary Literature say that the gathering by Anne Enright and Milkman by Andy Burns use complex chronological interlisting, so everything is interacting also on the time scale. And there is this haunting power of the unmetabolized event. So they look at how current generations of female writers command the critical attention much more than ever before, and they convey an authoritativeness that bespeaks a new social way. So it's the female writers that we're focusing on because they have a take on the so-called individuals. I think that Anne Enright is actually the leading light in this crusade against the idea of the individual and in the crusade against thinking in terms of entities. And I wrote a chapter, Anne Enright, Trauma and Fiction for the Cambridge History of the Irish Novel, which is supposed to come out later this year, in which I argue that Anne Enright uses feminine aesthetics. This is the term she used herself in an interview with me in 2007. And indeed, I then look in this article at what do these feminine aesthetics actually entail. And indeed, in the article, I then show that from The Portable Virgin, her very first set of short stories from 1995, to her most recent novel, The Red Red, we see that she is an intersectionalist. She is someone who doesn't think in entities, in nouns, but in adjectives and in verbs. So today we want to look at an Enright as one of the writers, but Lucy Caldwell is another. And Lucy Caldwell is very special in that she actually started a complete short story project on mother-child relations. At one point, she had rewritten the cherry orchards in the Belfast context, and it was a complete failure. And she thought, I have to leave Belfast, I have to start on something completely new, no more drama, I'm going to do short stories. And she had a meeting with an editor in Favor, and she says, I would like to focus on mothers and children. And the editor said, by all means, we will publish it. And so she started with Multitudes, which was published in 2016. After that came Intimacies, 2021, then Openings, 2024, and now, just a few weeks ago, Devotions came out in 2026. And one is better than the other, so she's really honing this kind of attentiveness that a mother gives to the child. And this will be the core business of my argument, that the readings that a mother makes of the child might offer a new kind of aesthetics and ethics that people can use maybe in normal life. So Colbert will be the first one we'll deal with, and then Doreen de Griefa will be the last one, more specifically A Ghost in the Throat from 2021, which Fogarty calls a process of translation, a meditation on motherhood, and a manifesto for contemporary feminism and female creativity. So again, we see feminism and motherhood will be at the center of these new aesthetics. Now, all these three authors, Enright, Caldwell, and de Griefa, have in common that they love psychoanalysis. They read Freud, Winnicott, Cixous, and others, and so in that sense, I feel entitled to use that kind of theory to explain what interactionality is, what is the in-between. And so in the first, we will look at the perception of the in-between in Caldwell, then which are the coordinates of this in-between, and then what is the phenomenon of the phantasm, and which role does the phantasm play in the interaction between. And so in order to do that, this is the only thing of Lacan I will tell you, and it's dead easy and very straightforward, as you will see. So Lacan, of course, does not believe in the individual. Instead, he says we are a set of vectors, and these vectors all start in the other. The other is actually to be understood in two different ways. The other is the culture in which we live, and it makes us blind to what is habitual, because that's just what we normally do. So we don't notice our own habits because they're just too close to our heart. So the other is something that we don't know, because the culture is what steers us, and as a result, we do not really see it anymore. But there is another understanding of the other that which we don't know, that we don't understand, and that is our own personal unconscious. And that means transgenerational material. So that's why Freud always said you have to go back 2 generations in order to understand yourself. So the more stories you know from your grandparents, the more you will understand yourself. So the other is transgenerational material, which is a manifestation of the unconscious that only is visible in an indirect way. What is meant by an indirect way? Well, you see that the arrow of the unconscious goes to the S. And the S is the subject. The subject is split, and that's why it's crossed out. It's a split subject because on the one hand, we get all this unconscious energy into our bodies, into our minds, into our emotions. And on the other hand, we want to play a role. So we play a role in a social kind of network. And so we relate to others. And those others can be either people or can be objects which form us, which influence us, which fascinate us. And so we either take them as an example or we just relate to them. And so we will see that certain objects will become phantasms. Certain objects will hit us and will become mental images that stay with us for the rest of our lives. They come back in images, in dreams. We see them in books, we recognize them in novels. But yeah, we'll talk about that later. So we project our unconscious energy onto others. We pick up models and we embody those models, so we play several roles throughout our lives. But we also interiorize some of those roles that we see in other people, and they become our ego, they become a kind of inner image that we have, and so we have a kind of body image of ourselves, which will change throughout our situations. So if we want to word this in between, this interactionality, we can look at what Freud says about it, Lacan, Merleau-Ponty, Irigaray, and Sissou. So I will just briefly refer to each of them. First of all, I would like to note that perception in the eyes of Lacan consists of three aspects or three dimensions. First, there is the real, and the real means that we are rooted in the unconscious. So we have fears, we have desires, and the fears and the desires work against each other, and as a result, we very often don't dare to desire and to get that which we really want. So we work against ourselves. And so the real is the contradictory impulses that we get from our unconscious. And if you're not in touch with that and you stay in a routine of life, Winnicott will say you're not realizing your real self. You're living a false self. You're doing what other people tell you to. And then there is the imaginary. So the real is the unspoken, the unarticulated, the unconscious, but the imaginary is the idea we have of ourselves. And that's, of course, an illusion, but it's an illusion that you need because you need to have a certain idea of yourself, a certain self-love. And so that is what Lacan calls the imaginary, our narcissistic self. And then there is the symbolic, and that is the social structures in which we live. And so they form us, they form our perception, as we will see in the stories that we will look at. We then see that Merleau-Ponty also says something interesting about the in-between, about the invisible interactions that happen between us. And he says, the sensible thing is not in the here and in the now, but it is not intemporal and aspatial either. It is not an ideality. It presides over a region. It is a field being. So he says what is really important is not one little thing, one entity, but you have to see the field in which something is actually working out. And Enright will do that a lot because she has, for example, a volume of short stories which she calls Yesterday's Weather. So weather and moods are this field being, this atmosphere that actually makes different things and touch them. So then further, Merleau-Ponty says in the visible et l'invisible, it would be naive to seek solidity in the heaven of ideas or in the ground of meaning. It is neither above nor beneath the appearances, but at their joints. It is the time that secretly connects an experience to its variance. So what we have here is he looks at the flesh, and the flesh is not just your skin or your body, but it is the skin that houses ideas, that houses emotions. So you can feel vibes in your, as they say in German, Fingerspitzengefühl. So you can your skin has memories from the past, and so it's with that kind of emotional skin that you're actually living. And so in that sense, we don't talk in these modern aesthetics about metaphysics, but about epiphysics. So the vibes that a baby gives, the vibes that you feel yourself. So then Merleau-Ponty uses this term, the flesh, the secret folds of our flesh, and he says that our physical, our material self houses a lot of immaterial associations, dreams, ideas, images, etc. And then we have Sissou, and Sissou has this book, which is called this term, which she called Écriture féminine, and she says we have to juggle the patriarchal phallogocentric system. So in order to get out of the static hierarchy that we usually speak and think and writing, we have to move to a dynamic fluidity. We have to move from directive beings with each other to suggestive ones. We have to move from one-way communication to mutual effects. And we have to move from binary oppositions to interactional ones. So instead of opposition, it's kind of meeting each other and interact. And so Irigaray would say it's a question of the logic of grammar. So we have to write in a certain way because it's the writing that will change our attitude. And so that's why she has this book called I Love to You instead of I Love You. So she changes the grammar and puts in this preposition in order to make the two-ness, the in-between, the vibes, more visible in the grammar of the language that she uses. And so Irigaray is someone who says we should, especially in literature, create more associative space because that will create greater self-awareness for the reader. And then Merleau-Ponty says, it is clear that Husserl himself never obtained one sole Wesenschau that he did not subsequently take up again and rework, in order to make it say what at first it had not quite said. And so what he's referring here is that there are sometimes you have an object that fascinates you, and that is a Wesenschau. You sense that it's more significant than anything else, but you don't know the meaning. And that is something that we will look at now. So first of all, Lucy Caldwell's modally perception. It's modally and bodily because, as you can see, in herself, in her short stories, and by now she has about 35 short stories, we see when we look at the three aspects of perception, the self, narcissistic self, the unconscious and culture, they're very clearly present in each of her short stories. First of all, we see that the self-love is very split, and that is, so the individual is not important, and she shows this in the sense that none of her protagonists has a name, but actually there's one. In the 35 stories, there's one protagonist with a name. The others don't, because as an entity, they are not important. It's their relations to others that are actually much more important. And so we see, indeed, it's always about relations. In Multitudes, it was a young daughter, and at the end of the story, it's a mature daughter and a young mother. In Intimacies, we see that the mothers become older and older, openings even older, and now in divorce. So she always writes about mothers who are her age, because that's what she really knows. But then, what we see in each of the volumes is that the mothers always have a very strong sense of their unconscious. They have deep-seated fears, and that starts from the very first short story, the Ali Ali O, where the daughter has fears that are disproportionate for a 12-year-old. But again, this would be a watermark for the rest of us. Caldwell's protagonists are also very aware of the fact that culture is very dominant and very steering. We always perceive things within a certain framework because we use certain vocabularies, we use certain iconographies. And so she has a story, Jars of Clay, in which she shows how young people, an American pro-life group, is indoctrinated by the group, by the leaders. In another story, Words for Things, she indicates that we are usually conforming. So one of the protagonists noticed that they are conforming. And this is a kind of knowing and not knowing, as if it was a technique rather than a state, a safety net, a way of coping. There were words for things now that we hadn't even realized were things, because there were no words. So we see, and we also saw this in an Enright, the gathering. She is not aware of abuse by the church unless it's talked about in the radio, and then words develop and people start talking. So again, culture has to change, otherwise you can't get to what's actually happening. So what we very often see in Caldwell stories is that the protagonists need to be scared or scandalized into the real. They have to be scandalized out of routine into the real. And indeed, there is a scene where Sinead O'Connor is actually destroying a picture by the Pope in order to say that something really rotten in the state. So what we also see in Caldwell stories is that she stresses the singularity of every person. So it's not the individual that counts, with the singularity of every relationship. And so she says in the last story of Intimacies, she says, love is a holding close and simultaneously a letting go. It's a difficult balance because the mother is terrified of getting in the way of the baby's life. But, and now she quotes within a fiction, she quotes the psychoanalyst, but rereading Winnicott's "His Good Enough Mother" is everywhere, as some things are when we most need to hear. You really have something to teach, says Winnicott to the professors who study medicine, about that other kind of knowledge, that which comes to you naturally. So that's what I want to focus on, this motherly knowledge of a baby, this kind of intuitive knowledge, this reading the baby as a character, as a body language, which is an opaque kind of language, and it's that kind of reading, that kind of perception that Caldwell tries to propose. Right. We also see that the mothers in these three books are very aware of the fact that they don't know their children, even though they are in their tummies, they're very close to their skin, they're closer than a lover, yet they don't know their children. So the not knowing is a very important part of these writers. And so I quote, one of the protagonists says, "As I grew you in my body, so too I grew you in my mind, a turning inwards, a kind of vigil, the dark art of imagining you into being. When you were born, of course, you confounded all expectations. You withheld yourself. So you so simply were that for the first hours, all I could say was that I didn't know it. Until, imperceptibly, and then all at once, something shifted and you were just you." So the individual is something that changes all the time in the eyes of the other. We just maybe discuss only one story by Caldwell, and that's called Mother's Day. And Mother's Day is the last story of the volume opening, so that was the previous title. So what we see here is a family of four, the dad, the mom, and two children. And the mom is very scared because her own mother left her when she was 40. And now she's nearing the age of 40. She thinks maybe I will do the same thing because I'm very uncertain with my children and I don't know how to relate to them. And so this is a very scared protagonist. As I said, we have a very important. So when the mother left the protagonist, her brother reacted to that in a withdrawal from all relationships. So he became a nerd of software and matrices, which could where nothing could ever really matter or make any difference. So he became completely indifferent to life, and he focused on gaming, which Freud would say is a kind of death drive, indifference, and complete passivity. But the protagonist is different. The protagonist wants to challenge herself, which means she follows the life track. And she chooses to go on weekly pilgrimages. And she goes to visit in the local museum the mummies of Kakauti and Chesmut village. They are Egyptian sarcophaguses, and she's really puzzled by these figures. So they are phantasms. They are things, they are objects which become images that stay with her for the rest of life. And so she is fascinated by them against her own volition. So again, a phantasm, an object can only become a phantasm if it touches your unconscious. That is the case here, because she says these two mummies were like some sort of morality tale whose meaning just eluded you. And she then reads up, like, why are these mummies so important to me? And she reads that they were wrapped in hundreds of meters of linen. Each layer was sealed with warm resin. And there were prayers to aid these dead in their journey. So again, what strikes her is the materiality of all these meters of linen and the prayers that are actually written into that lineage. Words and things are what are going to help. But then when the monk who has left the family actually dies, these images in her, these phantasms in her mind turn negative, and she has nightmares whereby she only sees the mouths that are howling. And so she has an effort to wrench myself away back into my own body. And she's feeling too thin-skinned. So here we have an example of what merleau-ponty means by the flesh. The flesh is something that contains your emotions. So what we have here are forms of the so-called epiphysical. And indeed, we see this in her son. Her son, Brody, is acutely sensitive. And so he has an incredible separation anxiety. And so the mother thinks these are fears not his own, because what could he possibly have to be so petrified about? So he's very scared that he feels maybe that his mom is going to leave him as well, even though she has never said that her mother left her. So there is this transgenerational material that really works directly on the child. And so the child terrifies the mother so much that I too would leave my boys that I almost wanted. So again, this energy that is there in the real, in the unconscious, is very, very strong. Now, what is interesting in these family aesthetics is that there's always somebody else nearby, in this case, the husband, who studies DNA. So he's down to earth, he studies skin in these DNA elements. And so the mother reads up on fetal microchimerism. So these are cells that travel through her blood, and it can be a healing process. So apparently a baby can give the mother in amniotic fluid cells, which then walk into her body and they heal the places where she's actually sick. So this is again a destruction of the idea of individuality, because these different people mix and mingle, not just in an immaterial, but also in material. So this is typical for Caldwell, that she focuses on this type of things. And she then wants to heal her son, and she tries to find rituals in daily life. And so she points out to her son, look how daffodils open. Because she says, I want to give the fools possibilities openings. So she looks and she makes the boy look at literally open things in order to open up his mind. And yeah, so I'll just end with the final sentence of that story. They all go to a garden and they have a drink and they put their hands together to our new life, her husband said, which is already just our life. We all touched cups to our life, we said, to life. So again, the life drive is what is very important to her, but she can only reach it through these phantasms, through her own images, and through dealing with these images. I'm not going to go into this story because it would lead me far way too. I'm actually going to skip the entire anyway, I'm afraid, because it will be way too long. And so we move to Doreen later. Moreover, Doreen will have a new book out in a few weeks' time, and so it will be interesting to see what she did in previous. So she is my champion of anti-individuals. A Ghost in the Throat, the title itself is already telling you that the immaterial and the material are very strongly interactive. And she, in her books and in her poetry, always has a very much a split self. So she's very aware of the real, very much of the unconscious. And she says at some point in this book, A Ghost in the Throat, which is a memoir, a life writing, and a novel, so it's a kind of very heterogeneous kind of genre. And she says, I am a splinter, a flimsy distillation of all the humans who collided in the haphazard pattern that eventually yielded me. A woman who birthed 4 children, who squandered her days in housework and daydream, a woman who lived for 36 years. So she has actually 4 children. This is autobiographical. But she is a splinter. She's not herself. She's a mother, and so she shares herself with the children. She's very aware of the unconscious, and she, as she says explicitly, how mysterious our instincts, those sudden engines that roar up to steer us towards new ends. So she knows that she's steered from the other and not just from her own plans and her own conscious decisions. And this idea of the unconscious, this awareness, comes from her culture. She grew up in an Irish, in Gaelic culture, and she describes also her youth, where she says, beyond the house I grew up in, a Leos interrupted the horizon. This was the heart that convulsed through all my inherent feelings. So the Leos, the idea that there was a fairy fort, is something that was part and parcel of herself, of her ideas of the makeup of her lives. Now, Giorgio Agamben wrote a very, very fine book, Stanzas, which cannot be praised enough. And in Stanzas, he explains that The stanza is, of course, it's a rule, it's Italian for rule, but of course it's also a poetry rule, which is a patient's dwelling, reception. And he looks at how the word phantasm, phantasmata, is already in existence since Aristotle and Plato. So they already used the word, and he's now drawing the history of this word. And he says indeed that the central theme of the Philebus is to show that desire and pleasure are impossible without this painting in the soul. Phantasm is a painting in the soul. And Lacan picks this up and he says, le fantasme fait le plaisir propre au désir. So he says that you have no proper desire without a phantasm. So each of us has an image which comes back to us in dreams and in real life in variations, but it is part and parcel of our life. And he refers to Aristotle, who said the phantasm is the necessary condition of intellection. So it's not just reason, but it's an emotional something that actually feeds into our intellect. The phantasm is something that we have to be receptive to, so we have to be passive but also active. Because, as Aristotle says, phantasms, dreams, are dreams that induce us to perform when awake the actions we are unwittingly accustomed to associate with those phantasms. Right. So Agamben then says that the phantasm is an insight that yielded one of the most fertile legacies for Western culture. It conceived of love as an essentially phantasmatic process involving both imagination and memory in an assiduous, tormented circling around an image painted and or reflected in the deepest. So it's this image painted and reflected in the deepest. Recently, I wrote an article about the fact that Yeats also says that every man has an image of his inner life, and he follows that kind of idea in his autobiographies and of course also in his papers. And then there are these Renaissance poets like Guido Cavalcanti who say love comes from a seeing form that is understood, until it becomes a form that penetrates through the external and internal senses, until it becomes a phantasm or intention in the phantasmatic and memorial self. So again, he actually, so Cavalcanti writes about the skin as something that contains images or pre-images in emotional kind of form. And indeed, Aristotle in the Anima talks about zoographema. So they are images that live, they change, they move, they're like an animation film, they even feed the image, the inner image that we have of ourselves. Yeah, I just move from here. And so Agamben also says it becomes the absent thing in every bouquet that makes the bouquet breathe. And that is exactly what happens in this novel, the Ghost in the Throat, because the ghost is Eileen Bloom's presence, and she is the aunt of David O'Connell, and she has written this scheme for her husband who has been murdered. And for some reason, Doreen Igrifa just loves this poem, this scheme. And she says, when we first met, I was a child, and she had been dead for centuries. So this Eileen Bloom hits her, this poem hits her with a strength that she does not understand. But it will form the marrow of this novel, which I call a Bildungsroman in the best sense, because we see how this phantasm stays with her throughout her life. And she says, if my childhood understanding of this poem was, well, childish, and my teenage interpretation little more than a swoon, my reading swerved again in adulthood. I had no more classes to attend, but I had set myself a new curriculum to master. So this is a poem that hit her as a child. She loved it as a teenager, as an adult, and now she decides, I will retranslate this poem. Even though I have 4 children, I'm dead, I have to wake up at night, but I will do this. So there is this kind of tenacity that inspires me. And so she says, I remembered my crush on that poem. I recalled all the skinny rock stars that were tacked to my teenage walls and the vocabulary they allowed me to express the beginnings of desire. This is exactly what Aristotle said. It's the phantasm that gives rise to your real desire, not somebody else's desire to endless. And so she wonders about the significance. Phantasm is something that hits you with significance, not with meaning. And so we see in the third paragraph, what is it about this, the protagonist asks, what is it about this poem that evokes such passionate pronouncements and such devotion? Although I don't understand it yet, something ricochets in me whenever I return to this image of a woman kneeling to drink from the body of a something that reminds me of the inner glint I feel. So this poem reminds her of something that she doesn't know, but she knows there is an inner glint, some anger in me that touches upon that. So this phantasm allows me to acknowledge something of that raw innocence of myself. And then we see, and that's a rather interesting way of putting it, the protagonist says, these years have shown me an oblique kind of holding. I have held her, this person in the form, and held her only to find that she holds me too, close as ink on paper and steady as it is. So that's typical of a phantasmatic image. It is active for you, but you're also active with it. So there is a kind of mutual. Yeah. I then move to the wife versus the death tribe. So she has this glimpse that there's something raw and dangerous in herself. And indeed, we see in the novel that the protagonist has tried to commit suicide several times. So she has had really dark times. And she refers to that when she says, I wasn't in the room when I dozed in A&E, my head nodding over red bandages with shards of a pint glass embedded in my face. But she then finds this poem and she feels a thumping pulse, she feels the life of these letters, the thumping pulse of a Hindu's presence. I'm starving, I long to know. So she goes from self-destruction, death drive, to desiring more and more love. And then even when she's about to have her fourth child, the child is coming early and things are going wrong and she starts bleeding and she thinks I'm going to lose the child. But even then, she thinks of getting that poem with her because that's her talisman, that's her the thing that she needs to have. And she said, grabbing my hospital bag, I fling my tattered photocopy of the Koina, I can't pronounce it properly. There is only one voice that never leaves my side. So even more than husband, this thing, this presence is part and parcel of us. So what are the features of the phantasm? The phantasm belongs to the inside world, but also to outside. So she's trying to find, where did this person live? How can I find the house where she lived? Can I touch on the walls where she lived? And so she goes with her little baby girl who survives easily to a few walls where this woman may have lived. And she says, I was reciting her poem, my voice springing back from the stone walls that once witnessed her voice too. When I say, Mahara Bo, my daughter peers up at me, amused, then tilts her head sharply, mimicking the cadence of my words. I say it again. This phrase one might begin to translate as, oh, my steady companion. I feel it so strongly there, her echo. This is our beginning. So the poem links the mother and the daughter stronger than anything else could have done. So whereas was her steady companion, now the daughter is also a steady companion. And there is a transgenerational link via hands. Very often throughout this novel, we see that the protagonist says this is a female text composed while folding someone else's clothes. So she's in the self, which is very much engaged with others, small world, her children, her husband, but also with the other dear interests. And so because of the phantasm, she can keep them all together. But then, of course, because sticking to your own singular mental image is something very strange because nobody else does it. It's your image, it's your idiom, and not anybody else. And that may be very difficult because people ask, why are you translating this poem? Why are you insisting on it? What's it to you? You're not even an academic. So you cannot explain your link to that image because it is so much an in-depth thing. And Freud said about that, when he was analyzing people, the more tangential, the more unimportant they thought their words were, the more important he thought them were, because they came from him. And that is what we see also in the read we have. I continue to find all the information I can find about Evelyn Blue's life, no matter how obscure or tangential. It's just all important. She also talks about this microchimerism. So again, it's something that all the women these days have in common. I could name a few other, like Kinsella, who wrote, Miss Kinsella wrote the book Milk, and she also refers to this. So there seems to be this tendency of feminine aesthetics or ethics or whatever you want to call it, whereby they want to bring this Merleau-Pontian flesh. He just wants to try to work with their field. And so it's where the material and the immaterial cross over and interact. And that's one of the major points of interaction that I wanted to touch on. And that's also why in these feminine novels, you see a very strong stress on the tactile senses. So it's not so much seeing or not even hearing, but it's the tactility of things, of dust, textile, of bodies, of skin that is important. That and the sense. Sense, tactile, and gustatory elements are the three close-up ones. So we always have the close ones that they go for. Right. So, yeah. So this is clearly not about masculine hierarchy, but the feminine mutuality. She wants to see this dead woman as her as a mutual influence on her. So she's angry with the academics who always categorize this Evelyn Douve as the wife of Arthur Leary or the aunt of Daniel O'Connell. How swift, the protagonist says, how swiftly the academic gaze places her in a masculine shadow, as though she could only be of interest as a satellite to male. She looks at what is really feminine here. But no, the theory then goes, it must be considered collage, or perhaps a faulty reworking of older themes. It feels like a male assertion is pressed here upon a female text. He wants to show that. And what is a female text? A female text is that we see sentence, a body holds so much beyond the visible. The king of Arthur Lear, of Eileen Leary, was preserved in our folklore through a succession of female bodies. It's the embodiedness of the text that is it. So she says, on the one hand, I have given months of my life to the effort of creeping after these strangers, these dead people, and for what? Because she doesn't know, it doesn't have any meaning. Phantasms don't have meaning, only significance. So she asks, for what? But then, whenever she comes into her own with the translation of that theme, she says, it gives a clue to my life, and the goosebumps swim the line of my spine. Again, a very tactile experience of truth and being the true self. The unconscious is always very much in link with consciousness. My favorite element hovers beyond the text, again, that epiphysical one, in an untranslatable pale space between stanzas, where I sense a female breath lingering on the stairs, still present somehow, long after the body has hurried onwards to breathe elsewhere. So again, the difference between living and dead people in this kind of aesthetics is not all that great. It's a matter of degree. It's a matter of degree of presence. So it's not, if you don't see the entities, you come out at a completely different view. She also says, I'm not going to get the last word about this, but that's no big problem. She says, some parts of every Douve's life I know now will always remain hidden to me, no matter how closely I Instead of resenting the many lacunae where I have not been able to find her, my hand has learned to hover over these gaps in all. And all is a central point. It's more than respect. It's like knowing the unsought known, and that's a term of Christopher Bollas. The unsought known is you know things without having articulated, but you know that they are. And then finally, I'm trying to stick to an hour. By way of conclusion, can we say that these kinds of writing open us to a new kind of in-between? And is there a kind of style of communication in the good enough model style, our Winnicott, within the right distance? And Lucy Caldwell would be very much for it, because as she says in her historical novel these days, one of the protagonists says, it does take courage to live a life that, at least to yourself, is true. So what does it mean to live your true self? And so we see that in these books by Nigreva and by Caldwell, the self and the other always interact. So we are not entities but interactional. We are both passive and active because we move to a dynamic kind of perception. We move from the patriarchal into the maternal in these texts, so not the matriarchal, but the maternal, which means that we move from hierarchical ruling to modest translations and compressed senses. So very often when these models describe their lives, it's through a kind of seeing feeling. It's a kind of haptic experience. We see that in this maternal kind of behavior, the epiphysics are important, and we move from oppositional schemes to positions. We have uncanny interactions all the time in order to destroy the routine of the patriarchal perception. We move from the general to the particular and even further to the singular, and so from the imitative to the experimental. Instead of causality and chronology, we move to reciprocity and the layered action or delayed action. So an adventure of insights to quote Tellman. We see that life and death drive interact all the time. The death drive is not ignored. And so throughout this kind of writing, we see a movement of the protagonist from certainty to a focus on the unexpected. So I can agree with Katharina Renhak that we have a kind of conversational ethics here, whereby people burst from one, they change from one kind of being into another. And so the singularity of personalities in these models is an ever-changing thing in interaction. And that would be, and but very importantly on that is the playful element. So what you should read, we should read these books in a playful way. And I haven't had time to refer to Anne Enright, but she's hilarious, as is Jack Carson, most of these women. So the playful element is of prime importance because you have to read against the grain, and then I think you come across these kind of. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that fascinating lecture. You're happy to take a few questions? Yes. Okay, so let me open it up. Yeah.
Sorry, when you professor talking about, would you say deconstructing matriarchy?
Yes.
When they deconstructed, I suppose they're doing it in different ways, but I got the impression with Lucy Caldwell, I know that she had perfectly know her work, that she would say that mothers are antagonists and daughters are protagonists. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, in Enright's early books, the mothers are the antagonists, absolutely. But as she writes on, they become much more interactive and much more mutual over many years, over 30 years. So it took her 30 years to get out of the antagonism, which is typical of a masculine approach. Also, the women in her early novels are much more masculine than
When you tell a story, you have to have some conflict, you have to have some kind of opposition, you have to have kind of a unity of opposites. And so in exploring that, they're able to kind of reveal something more, do you think, about being a mother than would if they had kind of not deconstructed it?
So you're saying you're more of a mother if you deconstruct yourself?
No, I'm saying that these people, these models, are trying to say that there's more to being a mother than simply giving love and affection and being that type of mother, as it were.
Yes and no. That's a very good question. That's a tricky one.
Okay.
In the sense that maybe I didn't stress that enough, but Winnicott says that he speaks of the good enough mother, not about the perfect mother.
Okay.
So the mothers make mistakes all the time, and so do the children. But that is of huge importance, because if you don't have the leeway of making mistakes and admitting this and changing, things are going very bad, as we see in societies right now.
So it's striving to be the best that you can be.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes.
Story obviously honors the idea of the lonely voice, the marginal individuals, being very influential, but there's also a lot of history of the short story that emphasizes its oral origins and communal experience. And then, of course, the Dearly Tarifa, the poem was being passed down orally through the generations in that more communal way, I suppose. So I wonder if you could comment on form.
Yes, in the sense that Lucy Caldwell is someone who is a bit like William Trevor, and that's saying a lot, because she's very precise in her form. She how shall I say? She always makes sure that the sentences that she makes leave an opening. So it's a bit like Joyce. Joyce is one of her great examples. And so everything is ambiguous and has undertones and has underlayers and has many associations. So in that sense, it's unfixed. But she tries to condense, because it's a short story, she condenses. And so she tries to, for example, the final sentence that I was giving here, to life, is the end of that volume. And so she wants to show that mothers open up to the openness. And she will always make sure that the final word of a short story and the opening word are very significant, so that you can do a lot with that. And that's what all short story writers do. They condense. But you're aiming more at the oral element, aren't you?
I guess I'm thinking whether there's something about, say, the short story which makes it particularly amenable to some of the documenting more than the realist novel or something like that. Because the novel you just got said.
Well, yeah. And Enright has a few realist novels, but the trick and the molding is in the sentence, on sentence level. So she uses a grammar whereby, for example, he used the muscle of compassion. A muscle of compassion means, or compassion had become a muscle. So she connects on the level of grammar, of describing and combining words, how the material and the immaterial are intertwined. So these intertwinings are actually realized on a grammar level, I think, and on a stylistic level. And you can do that in a novel as well as in a short story, I think. Yeah, if that's, yeah.
You want to go first, Maura?
I think that was really enjoyable. One of the things I'm interested in is about the really striking parallels that you've pulled out of the authors. So I wondered if you might sort of reflect on why that might be. You know, on one hand, I can see how, for example, the recent scientific thought is obviously informing. We now know about mitochondrial cell, you know, movement from fetus into mother and so on, which we might not have known 20 years ago. So are they kind of responding to things in our own culture, or are they influenced by each other? And then I'm going to ask a very quick second one. Then what about the other authors beyond them? Because it seems to be, we are, I think, in contemporary fiction now very much. There's so many authors I can think of that work in relation to interactionality. And somehow, I mean, in a less subtle way, you've really brought it out kind of really subtly in their very, these close readings. But, you know, thinking about so many polyphonic novels at the moment, Wendy Erskine.
Exactly, the
She was
benefactors.
right. I've just been reading
Yeah.
reviews, polyphonic, or Garrett Carr's, it's using the we, you know, the voice of the narrator is a collective, you know, so there's definitely, and Donal Ryan, of course, who you mentioned, you know, with again, polyphonic, lots of different perspectives. So there's definitely in contemporary fiction, this really strong push against individualism. So I suppose it's two parts. It's about their relationship with each other, and Mike Caldwell and Negrifa, your three case studies, and then it's also maybe saying something about how then they fit with these other writers, all these contemporary writers at the moment exploring these ideas.
Yeah. Well, actually, another example would be Claire Kilroy with the Soldier Sailor. Is also very much she and the sailor talking to each other and interacting all the time. And there is no one else to interact because except the husband and in hilarious disagreements. But it shows the tightness of the mother-child relation, because especially in Ireland, where you don't have too many creches and you have to look after your kids yourself, which is hard work. And so Alice Kinsella also got a breakdown. Kilroy actually got a breakdown. So these things make it all more intensive. And so they write in this more intensive way, and they use neologisms, and they use they're dead keen on the microchimeric kind of knowledge that you can have. And so they seem to look for it. Like they both say, Caldwell and Negrifa, both say they looked up the Smithsonian Museum to find that word. So there's a clear parallel, and Kinsella mentions it as well. So there is something that people are looking for. How can we, it's the whole question of vibrant matter. So how can you make this idea of vibrant matter believable, scientific, not just intuitive, but maybe to have more explanation about what's very important to us, to get away from the dualisms. And so any way that we have to get out of the dualism and into another kind of thinking is what they grasp. And they all do that. There's a few, what's her name? Thin Places. Carrie Doherty, yeah, also tries to do that. So it seems to be a general thing. Erskine also, but in different ways. She's